In this video, I will be swatching and sharing my first impressions on the Caran 15 Gouache Studio palette that I received from a gift card that I got for Christmas. I initially left the sleeve on so I could show how the packaging came, but I removed the plastic so that I didn't have to unwrap that on camera. On the inside of the sleeve is a swatch card. So I cut open the sleeve and I kept the swatch card, and I started with the swatch card that was provided by Caran, and then I moved on to my own swatch card afterwards. So here I am opening up the palette for the first time. I've actually, at this point, never seen gouache in person. I've never used gouache. I've only seen a few videos here and there. I was interested in picking up this palette because I received a gift card for Amazon.com and I wanted to place an order using my gift card. I thought that this was a good palette that I could potentially play with to learn color theory off of. I basically watched a few reviews of this specific palette, and I thought this would be a great jumping off point for color theory because it had a good blend of warm and cool colors in it. So here I am playing around with the watercolor brush that was provided with it, and I'm running into a few issues. Fortunately for me, just before I started playing with my palette, I watched another review where somebody mentioned that the colors in the palette weren't in line or in order with the swatch card. So I reviewed the swatch card and I checked it against each of the colors, and I had to re-put the entire palette back in order so that it was in line with the swatch card. This is important for me as a learner and a beginner because I don't really know colors by sight, and I really do rely on these references. So it wasn't really a great experience to know that the colors didn't match up with the sequence that I see in the swatch card. But I was grateful that I was able to very easily pop out the colors and double check everything. Once I got everything in order, I was able to start swatching. Now that I have all the colors in the proper order, I'm able to start swatching. I start out by using the brush that is provided by Caran. However, unlike many other reviewers, I didn't find the brush to be all that great. The ferrule was a bit loose and it was wobbly, and I couldn't decide if it felt stable in my hand. So after a while, I do end up switching the brush. I go through and I swatch all these colors just really quickly, mainly so I have them as a color reference. I'm not really trying to learn too much about them. But this is my very first time ever touching gouache. So I went in with it thinking, or went through it feeling like I don't see much of a difference at this time between gouache and watercolor. I didn't quite get it yet. So I was a little worried that I had made a terrible mistake. Now that I'm done with my swatch card that is provided by Caran, I decide to move on to my own swatch card. I was using Canson XL, and I like to pre-lay out my own swatches ahead of time. I use a different stamp from my stamp collection each time. In this case, I just use a simple circle stamp to create an area to make my swatches in. I decided to use a simple stamp this time instead of something like a flower or a house, which I've done before in the past. That way I could really see the paint and just start to understand the difference of gouache versus watercolor. At this time, you will notice that I've switched brushes. I gave up on the Caran brush and I switched over to a rather inexpensive watercolor brush that I have in my collection. I wasn't sure, and I'm still not sure, what exact brushes I should be using with gouache. My thought was that I should be using watercolor brushes. In later experimentation, I found that flat brushes also work very well with them. So I'm not exactly sure, but I did struggle with the brush quite a lot. I found that if I had a brush that was too big, the paint got really stuck up in the higher part of the bristles and just sort of like wouldn't release. But if the brush was too soft, it would also get really stuck up in the brush bristles. So it needed somewhat of a firm brush, but not too firm. And you wanted to make sure that you had the right size for your project. I found that later on in experimentations, I found that if I sized down from one size of brush based on what I would have done with watercolor, that was a pretty reasonable fit with gouache so far. As I continue to make my swatches, at first I'm still not very clear on the difference. And I've come to later understand that this might be because of the choice of gouache that I have selected. Gouache is supposed to come in a tube, and it is supposed to have more of like a watercolor, but in the tube type of consistency. It's thicker, and then you water it down slightly. I've heard reference that it should have the consistency of ice cream when you go to use it, of melted ice cream when you go to use it, or a really, really thick, heavy cream. So I didn't really know that going into this. I was just messing around and going on what felt right, what was painting smoothly. And I also heard in hindsight that this particular palette, because it's a dry gouache palette, isn't going to have that same thickness, and it's a little bit harder to get to the right consistency because it's dry. So a learner might like me might struggle a little bit, and I did struggle trying to figure out what the right consistency was, and how much gouache I should be using and versus how much water I have on my brush. And I toggled back and forth between not having enough water and having way too much water. Eventually, I did start to see some of the differences between gouache and watercolor, though. One thing I noticed was that I could really see my brush strokes. In watercolor, your brush strokes don't really show because the water moves around on the paper and it blends together and it flows beautifully. But in gouache, you see your strokes and it can dry that way. And I guess this is what makes it layerable, but it took me some time to really understand that. I've also since learned that if you activate your gouache palette, your dry gouache palette ahead of time, you'll struggle a lot less with it. And you need to use more water than I did to activate it. You can activate all of these pans. You don't need to activate just a portion of it like you would in watercolor and then dab up some of the color and then put it in a puddle of water. That you don't really work that way. You would have better success if I put more water in each of the colored pans and let it sit for a minute or so before I start painting. And then I would be able to paint straight from the pans. And I would use the palette as just a mixing surface. So I tried that eventually, not in this time, but another time when I went and was playing with this palette. And I found a lot more success in getting the right consistency. I still have been nervous to really do that because I feel like I'm wasting the paint. But I don't know how else to get the right consistency that I'm supposed to get. I'm considering after this maybe purchasing a different set of gouache, like a proper set, just a learner gouache like Arteza or Meeden, but just so I can see the consistency and understand what the difference is so that I have something to reference as a frame of reference, because I'm really going off of nothing here other than the instinct of how it's feeling when I'm painting. And I wrap it up by testing out the white. And I apologize because I did this a little bit off camera accidentally. But essentially, I finish up all of my swatches and then I move on to some experimentation. Just because after I completed the swatches, I realized that I had some questions and I was starting to note the difference between watercolor and gouache. And I wanted to just test out a few quick theories. So the first thing I try to do is mix it separately, and maybe I can build up the consistency the way I'm supposed to. And I try to just make some petals. I just want to paint something and see how it actually works. And it's kind of goopier than watercolor. I don't know a better word to describe it. And so it's been hard to find that right consistency. So I'm just messing with it and trying to see like how what's the consistency that I can make a proper stroke. I don't run out of paint and it's not incredibly streaky. I don't mind the streaks. I think they add character and a little texture, but at the same time, I run out of paint and it gets a little dry as well. So I don't have the right consistency yet, but I'm still working on it. And then I mess around a bit more and I try to layer and I do this and that. But in the end, I just play around and that's kind of it. And so I won't bore you by continuing on too much of my experimentations. I did move on after this and try it out in what I love to refer to as my What Does This Do sketchbook. And then which is where I learned a few of the things that I talked about in this voiceover. So, if you happen to have a Caran d'Ache palette like this, please give me some advice in the comments. I really need some help on figuring out how to get started and to figure out what the consistency is that I should be striving for in this palette, and also what's the best brushes that I should be using, because I'm very torn on how I should be doing this. I really don't know. So thank you so much for staying here and watching this through to the end if you made it to the end. And I would love to hear your advice in the comments if you happen to have any experience with this palette.